So I'd just like to welcome everyone to the South Atlantic Coastal Study. This is one of our quarterly webinars. And I am Donnie Grimsley. I show up on the list of attendees as the SACS facilitator. So if anyone has any issues or questions and is able to send a chat or a question to me, I'm happy to help with any technical problems, any issues with sound or seeing the screen or anything like that. So feel free to send me a message. Ashley, did you want to do a quick introduction and then we can move on to some housekeeping items?
We can do that when we go through the study team. Let's go ahead and move forward through housekeeping.
Sounds good. All right. So I'll look to the next slide here. All right, just some general housekeeping. Lines will be muted during the webinar. If you have questions or comments throughout the presentation, please submit those via the chat or the question box. I will be constantly monitoring that. There will be specific times during the presentation where we will pause and answer questions, both from the question box and the chat box. If you do have something that you feel needs an immediate response though, please raise your hand. I'll be monitoring that as well, and we can allow time for questions throughout the presentation as well. There are actually a few things in the handout section. We have the SACS placemat, the current version of that. We also have a PDF version of the slides. So both of those are available to download. And to get things kicked off, if you all wouldn't mind, just to get an idea of who's here, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself via the question box, just let us know who you are and the agency or group that you represent. And with that, I will be looking at that as we move along. So Ashley, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Donnie. I'm monitoring the questions and I see all of the attendees calling in. So I just want to say, hey, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ashley Fountain. I am the Regional Project Manager for the South Atlantic Coastal Study, and this is our team that we have here on the line today. You just heard from Donnie, one of our facilitators behind the scene. Donnie and Jenny are helping and supporting us here today. We've got our command team on and representation from the project management team as well. Just wanted to we are providing updates here today. So our regional project manager, Pam Castens, who you have heard from over the past 3 years, has taken a different position with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and I am now the project manager for Jacksonville District and also dual-hatted as the regional project manager as well. So I've saw names in the attendee list. I worked with many of you. You have all been involved in our workshops that we had for Jacksonville District and our area of responsibility, but I'm happy to be the project manager for all of this South Atlantic coastal study effort for the entire division. So with that, just want to say welcome, thank you. I'm always amazed at the attendance for these meetings. I'm really happy to get emails from our SAC stakeholders. You know, I tend to get those on a weekly, at least monthly basis, asking questions about where we are. I'm happy to receive those emails and provide updates. You know, we have our quarterly, we have these webinars, and we also have our newsletters, but happy to always answer questions along the way. So with that, that's who we've got here. Today, you'll be hearing from myself. I'll give some updates and reporting out on our draft product reviews. And you'll also be hearing from Matt Schrader, our planning lead, who's going to kind of walk through some specific changes and updates we want to report on for those draft products. And then we'll conclude with hearing from Idris and having a technical discussion. So that's who you'll hear from today. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide before I read out the whole agenda, before we even get to that one. All right, so there will be and I hope I'm not stepping on your toes, Donnie, but there will be a poll that'll open up here in a minute. Just try to figure out, who's calling into this. And as Donnie asked, we are also asking if you can put in your name and affiliation. Sometimes when we see FEMA, we're not necessarily sure, for instance, where, what region. So if you could just kind of let us know those details. Lisa Clark, our outreach lead, always likes to keep our stakeholder database updated. So, and since you all can't see all of the attendees in this particular format, this way it gives you kind of a good breakout of who else is on the line. So
that's right. So our poll is open. It looks like a little over half of you have selected an answer. So we'll just give a few more minutes or seconds actually for you all to get those responses in. And then once I close it, we'll all be able to see the distribution of responses on that one. All right, I'm going to go ahead and give us just another second.
Thanks, Donnie.
Yep.
So these are our poll results. Hopefully you can see those. What I like to look at with these and what I find interesting is how they kind of compare with responses that we received from our draft products and our previous webinars and engagements. So we do have, which is great, a lot of state and local agencies represented. So, and then at least we have representation and a good representation from other stakeholders as well. So if you've classified yourself as another stakeholder, just also would like to hear from you. Maybe we can add another poll option in the future or figure out how we can better represent you all. So next slide, what are we going to talk about today? What's on the docket? All right, so what we wanted to share with you all is, here we are, and I'll cover the schedule here in a second, but we're in our fourth and final year here with the South Atlantic Coastal Study. And I hope you all have been involved with us from the beginning or have joined us along the way. But just want to kind of provide an update on our study products, where we're at with those. And then most recently, we released our draft report at the end of last year. So what have we been doing since then? What have we been doing with comments received? And I think what you may want to hear and what we were kind of brainstorming, what we should have at this webinar is how we can advance those recommendations. So we did have a recommendations table, and all of our draft report products and the draft recommendations table are still available on our webpage. But how can we advance those and move those forward? So we'll talk through that. And then, like I said, we'll have Idris walk us through our SACS, economic technical products. And so these products came online right around the time our draft report was released. I know that you have heard some of us talk about these products at, for instance, focus area workshops, but Idris will kind of walk you through, and there'll be a lot of information on these slides. And like Donnie mentioned, these slides, the PDF is available in the resources tab of this webinar. So if you want to go back and refer to those, I certainly encourage that. But Idris will try to cover a bunch of information in our allotted time slot. And then I'll cover our path forward as we are charting towards the end of the study. So with that, let's just go through the schedule overview really quick. Not to overwhelm anybody here, but on the left-hand side, you can kind of see all of these rows represent products or engagements. And so we are continuing our stakeholder engagement along the way. We've been reaching out to stakeholders as necessary and coordinating as far as when we have questions pertaining to recommendations or comments received. And then you'll see here that the MCL, the Measures and Cost Library, you can see our geospatial products, a lot of those are all viewable right now. So if you go to our Geo portal, our state appendices, state and territory appendices, those went out for draft. Those drafts went out for review along with the main report. And those are the two that we're kind of working on through until the end. So that's kind of really what I wanted to point out today, is that a lot of our products are pretty much wrapped up, and what we are continuing to work on and refine and strive for perfection are these appendices and our main report, and within those are our recommendations moving forward. So that's kind of the basis for our discussion here today. Kind of follows the agenda. And then as far as the SACS key products, which is this next slide, this is from our placemat that is also posted in the resources tab for today. These are all available, they're all online, and you can find them through our SACS webpage. And I just have the two that are circled here, or not all of these are online, all of these are working and almost, and in their final stages of becoming final. But what I have circled here, the two red circles, the MCL and the Tier 2 Economic Risk Assessment, or as you'll hear us call Tier 2 ERA, that is what we will be going into a little more detail today. And then what I found kind of interesting is this next slide, just kind of seeing if, what products or tools are being used and which ones are getting the most. I said hit counts, but I don't think that was the correct terminology, but number of page views really. So we have all of these products out there that our team has worked so diligently on over the past several years, and we're really trying to put these out there for use. And so we know that some of our study teams are using these, but you can see here from these numbers that they are being accessed and used, and that's really exciting and encouraging. And we know that coordination with you was valuable in developing these as well. So just wanted to take a moment to say thank you. And I just think it's always kind of cool to put stats out there when we're talking about all of these products. So let's move on into the draft report, public comment overview, and advancing recommendations. So a lot of those products that I just kind of discussed that have been coming online that are viewable at this time were used in our draft report products. So, and will be used and can be used in advancing our recommendations. So just wanted to talk about our draft report public comment period, and just let you all know, what we received as far as comments and what were some general themes and what we're doing with those. So if you don't know, our draft report products were the public comment period was 15 October through November 16th of last year. We boiled those down. It came out to 262 specific comments for public comments that came through, and that review period, our public comment period, actually coincided with our policy review, our internal U.S. Army Corps of Engineers policy review, and agency technical review. So we received 262 public comments, but I think we have close to 600 that we've been working through since October of last year. So our teams have been busy, worked over the holidays to kind of start digesting those, and we still are. So that's kind of what I wanted to get through. Over here on the right, this pie chart kind of just represents the bulk or the breakdown of the comments received. So remember how I was saying I kind of like to see how our engagement kind of mirrors with our products and comments received. The majority of the comments came from state and local agencies, which it's, first off, I'm just happy to know that our products are out there and they're being read, and we're getting comments to try to make these documents better. So while it's overwhelming to kind of work through all of these comments, they are working to make our documents better, and appreciate that, and I know our teams do as well. So majority of the comments came from state and local agencies, and then we had a good bit of federal agencies that reviewed, and NGOs as well, and academia and others. And so this could have been private industry. This could have been the general public as well. And so just a really good range of reviewers. And when we rolled out our draft report products, we had a series of 9 webinars. So this next slide kind of covers that. So we had 9 webinars to roll out our draft report products. We had, you can see Florida has kind of sticking out right there in this chart. And we had 2, to be fair, there were 2 workshops for Florida. Mobile District and Jacksonville District kind of share Florida. And so we split up, we had 2 webinars. So that is, sorry. My coworkers can be a little noisy at times. I apologize for that. There hasn't been any barking all day up until now. So just wanted to say, you know, we had 500 participants in these webinars. So I think we had a really good feedback at those, and we did receive comments. And even at those workshops, we're constantly trying to improve and adapt as we go. And so Matt will talk about one of the changes we made that kind of responded to some of our draft report rollout webinar comments. So we got comments at those webinars as well. This next slide kind of has a breakdown of where we received the most comments. And the main report received the majority of the comments. The Florida appendix actually received the majority of the comments, and then the main report followed by the main report, and then the South Carolina appendix. But the Florida appendix it's a pretty hefty appendix because of all of the focus area action strategies in there, so that makes sense to me. And then the main report as well, because it's a roll-up of all of our appendices. So that is the general breakdown that we received here. And again, comments received are being evaluated, and we have been making adaptations to our documents. And with that, I think it goes to our next slide, which talks about our draft report public comment overview, so a continuation of this discussion. And at this point, I'll hand it off to Matt Schrader, our planning lead for the SACs, to take it from here. Matt, are you on?
Yep, thanks, Ashley. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, you can go give your coworker a dog
we
biscuit.
did have, I don't know if you wanted to pause for a question. We did have a question roll in. I would like to include your data on a web map application. When will the map server data or shape files be available?
That's a very good question, and that's one that we are trying to pinpoint a date internally. Right now, it's looking like June, and that's because that's when our products become final and we don't anticipate any more changes to those tools. So right now we're tracking for June.
This is Trevor. I can add to that.
Oh, okay. Hey, Trevor.
Hey, good afternoon. It's Trevor Lancaster, the Geospatial Discipline Lead. Yeah, our map services are currently available. If whoever posed that question, feel free to reach out to me and I can get you the service endpoint so you can include those into a web mapping application. But yeah, just to echo Ashley's comment, we're looking to June to actually have those data available for download. So just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Thanks, Trevor. Any other questions that we need to address, Donnie? Sorry, I didn't pause for questions before I handed it off.
That's fine. I'm not seeing any other questions. If there are any, please feel free to add those to the question box. But I think at this point, we're okay to move ahead.
All right, thanks, Donnie. Thanks, Ashley. Everybody, Matt Schrader, I'm the planning lead for the regional study. There are 5 separate district leads that do all the good work, and I'm the one reporting out on it here. I'm going to just briefly get into some detail on recommendations received and resulting edits. Just shown there on the left side, you can see the draft SACS products that were reviewed. Those remain available at the link shown over there on the left. As Ashley mentioned, the comment period is closed, but products still viewable for those that are interested. So just a few broad example comments are shown on the right side of the screen. The first sub-bullet there is that additional information should be provided, particularly in the main report, on efforts that other stakeholders are leading. I'm sure many of you know, because many of you will have looked specifically at the state and territory appendices. That's where a lot of this information is. But and we tried to generally keep the main report lean and mean, but definitely got some comments on pulling some of that info from the appendices back up into the main report. And I'll show at least one example of that in just a couple minutes. There were also questions on how SACS findings and results would get out to a wider audience, and specifically to socially vulnerable communities. For those of you who have been involved with the SACS, from the start, we kind of kicked this off, always reiterating that we're covering 65,000 miles of shoreline, and this incredibly large study area really necessitates reliance on the shared actions of all stakeholders to assess, communicate, and address risk. And this is just another example of where follow-on efforts by the USACE, but again, by all stakeholders at the regional and local levels are really needed to get the results down to the local level or down to specific communities. And that's where this reliance on shared responsibility, again, really comes through. As far as RSM, or Regional Sediment Management, we had a number of positive comments on SAC's efforts to advance RSM actions. But there was some particularly wanting to emphasize where other agencies or stakeholders can play a role. We had some comments saying, hey, this is a great effort. Maybe we can advance this through our authority or we have this parallel effort going on. And in those cases, those comments were passed on to the district levels for district follow-up on some of those. And similarly, edits were made to the documents, particularly the main report, to clarify where multi-agency action is needed. Instead of just the Corps doing something, right, or another group such as BOEM, but really where the efforts of multiple agencies can come together to push something, particularly regional sediment management related, push those types of actions forward. Finally, the fourth sub-bullet there on the screen, comments noted that the hazards that are included in our geospatial products in particular, some of the comments were particular to the Tier 2 economic risk assessment. Again, Idris Dobbs, he's going to be presenting on this specific tool later, so you'll be able to see kind of what we're talking about. But that the hazards that the geospatial products include are storm surge inundation, that erosion, wave attack, those aren't included in the Tier 1 risk assessment or the Tier 2 economic risk assessment for various reasons explained in the main report. So we did make some edits based on those types of comments, and I have another slide on this. And as I mentioned, Idris Dobbs, he'll be jumping into the Tier 2 economic risk assessment, and you'll be able to kind of see the results of that assessment and how storm surge inundation was incorporated. Next slide, please. I might, there we go. So with all the comments received, we needed to go back to the SACS goals, and you guys have seen these for a while, but making sure that any potential revisions were staying aligned with the SACS goals. Even the SACS goals were revised. If you look at goal number 3 there, identify and assess risk management actions, we particularly put in some clarification here. In this one, we called out public health and safety. I have a slide that'll talk about this. I just wanted to point out that even our SACS goals were revised as a result of comments received. So we went back to these goals to make sure that any potential revisions would kind of stay aligned with the goals, particularly that they'd help serve all decision makers, both local, state, federal levels, that any revisions would help to address the most vulnerable areas, provide information to stakeholders to promote and support their resilience efforts, again, leveraging all the multitude of efforts that are ongoing throughout the study area, and leverage the many ongoing actions to manage coastal storm risk, again, throughout the entire 65,000 miles of coastline, wanted to make sure that we were staying true to those goals. Next slide. So I'm going to go into just a few specific developments that have been made since the draft report came out. Some of these were resulting from specific comments received during this period, and others were comments, feedback, etc., received outside even before that. This is one example of some work that's been ongoing for a while, but that we've been able to incorporate that you'll see in the final report. And these are state and territory specific web applications. I think many of you are familiar by this point of our overall GeoPortal, our Tier 1 risk assessment, etc. We now have these state and territory specific web apps. These were developed to provide relevant info to stakeholders and also serve as kind of a companion application to state and territory appendices. As you're reading through the Puerto Rico appendix or the Mississippi appendix, there's reference made to specific data sets that are specific only to those states or territories, and maps are included, etc. But often it's difficult to kind of zoom into your area of interest when you're looking at an entire state or territory. So since the beginning of SACS, we've been talking about this idea that rather than just having static maps, people really need to be able to zoom in and see the regional data that we used at the Tier 1 level, but also the state and territory specific data we're using at the Tier 2 level in appendices. So these actually are available now. The link is up there at the top, and of course you can get to it through the SACS website, the SACS GeoPortal, etc. And just shown there on the slide, there's one for each state and territory, just kind of zoomed into the U.S. Virgin Islands to St. Croix, so you can see some of the specific data that's available there. All right, we're on the next slide. I mentioned this one earlier, had some comments that what we're showing here is the Tier 1 risk assessment, just a screen grab, but that this only includes risk from storm surge inundation. As explained in the main report, storm surge inundation is really, when you're looking at such a large study area, storm surge inundation is what's really driving the majority of the risk. Erosion, wave attack are absolutely critical hazards. They are addressed in Tier 2, but they're not covered in the geospatial products, particularly when you're looking across the entire study area. We just don't have those data sets, those consistent data sets available across the entire study area to look at the probability of different, for instance, different degrees of erosion occurring. We don't have those probabilities that we can apply across the entire study area. So consistent with the North Atlantic Coast Comprehensive Study Methodology, these geospatial risk assessments use storm surge inundation. So we wanted to make that clear that when folks are looking at these things, it does only include storm surge inundation. So you can see circled up there at the top. Again, this is the Tier 1 risk assessment, but this is storm surge inundation risk, and that's what the results are relying on. Next slide, please. Okay, just a few other quick highlights. Several comments asked about the degree to which life risk and public health and safety were discussed in the report, emphasizing that these topics were generally missing from main report findings. As mentioned earlier, a reason for that is much of the discussion on this type of thing was in state and territory appendices, things such as failure of wastewater treatment systems impacting public health, or limitations on emergency response during or after a storm. An example of that shown in the picture on the right, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and emergency vehicles having to go through floodwaters, etc. But these comments helped us to better pull this info from the appendices and summarize it in the main report. So these resulted in additions to the SAC's goals. I touched on one of those earlier, but also the opportunities and objectives. And just as an example shown there on the third bullet, we added in language to reduce impacts to life risk, public health, and safety to that objective. And also, based on findings of the fourth National Climate Assessment and also EPA's recent 2021 report, Climate Change and Social Vulnerability in the U.S., this objective is particularly applicable to socially vulnerable populations, which can be disproportionately impacted by coastal storms. So that was specifically called out here in the revised version. Additionally, increasing the description of stakeholder-led efforts, mainly in the main report. Again, we brought a lot of these examples up from the state and territory appendix, kind of created a new section in the main report where we have at least one example from each state and territory. And they all kind of highlight different actions. Some are regional sediment management led, others like the one highlighted here from North Carolina that's specifically about hurricane evacuation and know your zone. A lot of different varieties of stakeholder-led actions to kind of highlight those, but also serve as examples to other state and territories to see kind of what some of the highlights are that are going on in their partnering state and territories throughout the South Atlantic Division. Next slide, please. So finally here, kind of, what are some of the next steps at this point for the SACs? Really important to the SACs, it was always intended to take action as the study developed, not wait for 4 years until it was finished. And there's a lot of actions that are already underway as a result of the SACs. Highlighted on this slide is that particularly agencies need to continue coordination to overcome institutional and other barriers that have been identified in the report. One example of this is to improve our consideration of environmental benefits that are provided by coastal storm risk management projects. This is highlighted in the last recommendation at the bottom of the table shown on the slide. This is something that the original draft report highlighted as kind of a USACE action. There are efforts going on in USACE to better quantify or better even qualify the environmental benefits that are provided by CSRM projects, or they could be if we're just studying it. And some comments said, this is really something that takes multi-stakeholder action to really advance it, to help develop the metrics or the methods, et cetera. And so that recommendation was modified as a result. As far as the recommendations that are shown in this table, I just want to emphasize this is just an example of some of the multi-agency recommendations that are made in the SAC's main report and appendices. These are also compiled in a table that has all of the 200 plus recommendations. And that table, as well as the main report and the appendices, those are all, again, still available at that link that I showed earlier on the slide. So you can go and take a look at all of those SAC's recommendations if you haven't had an opportunity yet. The second bullet there at the top about recommendations, we're having ongoing discussions on the potential need for letters of support from stakeholders that are specifically mentioned in recommendations. So at this point, we wanted to just mention that today, kind of just as a FYI, and there might be more to come on that, but we wanted to kind of call that out, and that you may hear from the SACS team or from district leads, et cetera, if your agency or stakeholders are specifically mentioned in a recommendation. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, the concept of shared responsibility, it's so critical to resilience across such a large study area, and advancing SACS recommendations is reliant on actions from all stakeholders. So our large stakeholder groups, kind of our regional groups, we sometimes referred to them as kind of umbrella stakeholders, these bigger groups that have the local groups kind of tied into them. They've really been great partners throughout the study, and we continue to rely on them, or the SACS continues to rely on them and others to share the report findings and recommendations out and down to that local level and throughout their regions. So with that, I can pause for questions if there are any, and after that, I'll pass it over to Idris Dobbs. Donnie, I guess I'll hand it over to you for any questions.
Sure. We're not seeing any questions in the question box. Does anyone have a question that they would like to ask? If you raise your hand, I can unmute you, or if you would like to submit it, we can certainly read it out.
There was a hand raised. Helene, I believe, had her hand raised earlier, or Hope Sutton, actually. Hope, not sure if you still have your question, but I saw your hand raised.
Yeah, if you still do, please raise your hand and I can unmute.
Yeah, let's just unmute her.
Let's see. Hope, it looks like you're self-muted, so if you could also unmute your microphone on your end. You're unmuted on my end.
Oh, it was an accidental hand raise.
Oh, okay.
That happens sometimes. Okay, so any other questions on the line? We are monitoring those hand raises, and also if you put it in the chat. But thanks, Matt, for going through kind of draft report updates and changes and ways we have adapted, and talking about, you know, how we can advance our recommendations moving forward. Like Matt mentioned, we may be reaching out in the future. So just appreciate all of our coordination that we've had up to this point. I'm not seeing any other questions right now, so let's go ahead and move over to Idris. Idris, are you on?
William.
Oh, sorry.
William Crow, did you have a question? Sorry. Looks like we have one more hand raised, guys. William, did you have a question? I can unmute you.
I do.
Looks like you should be able to talk. There we go.
Can you hear me okay?
And we can, yep.
So Bill Crow at Port Canaveral, and appreciate the explanation and the study. Question I had, maybe Matt might be able to answer it, but as I was listening, there was a discussion with regards to sea level rise in conjunction with storm surge. And I'm wondering, that's a big question here that we often talk about. So, you know, sea level rise being one topic, but having a storm on approach and having that additional hazard of the storm surge, what would be the best tool for us to use to capture water levels from both hazards combined?
That is a great question, and I'm going to tee up Dr. Drew Condon to take that, because what he's developed under SACS is the Coastal Hazard System, which can provide that info. Drew, do you happen to be on?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. Yeah. Yeah, Matt's correct. Probably the Coastal Hazard System would be an ideal tool for that. I can send you specifically some more info on it, but it's a web-based tool. You can pull up, there's many thousands of save points off the Florida coast. I'm sure, can't think offhand, but I'm sure there's plenty right around Port Canaveral, including offshore and within the port facilities itself. And you can pull up annual exceedance probabilities for both current day sea level and 2 future sea level rise scenarios. If you're concerned with some intermediate sea level rise scenario that wasn't modeled, you can always just interpolate between those. But there's a whole lot of data there. I'd be happy to follow up with you with additional data or additional information, I guess, and give you a little more background on the development of that data. But that's probably the best source that we have out there. And like I said, there's plenty of save points and locations, so you can find your area of interest and pull the data that you need.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I do have it pulled up right here and was looking at some of the filters, and I have the South Atlantic Coastal Study plugged in. We're going through a resiliency effort here, looking at our high risk facilities, backup generators, lift stations, even finished floors for some key facilities. And so that's been a big question as we are forward thinking, and there's actually grant money available for this. As we look to elevate some of that critical infrastructure, what's our target? And so really have been anticipating the release of this South Atlantic Coastal Study. And I would appreciate any additional information on how to interpret that tool.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. If you don't mind just dropping your email in the question box or the chat box, and I can follow up with you specifically for that.
I will. Thank you.
And Drew, it looks like Volusia County would be interested in that as well. I'm just looking at the chat, and we have an email in there, so we can share with both parties.
Yep, looks like we have a few other individuals that are interested as well. So if you are interested in that data, please drop your email in the question box. We did also have a question, will the shapefiles for combined storm surge and sea level rise information be available? It sounds like a similar question.
I don't know if that's specific to the tier 1 risk assessment, those shapefiles, which is similar to what Trevor was saying earlier, and that Ashley mentioned as well, the target date for I think it was early this summer, around June timeframe. The CHS is individual save point locations. We don't necessarily have a shapefile of all that data, since it's very there's a whole lot of data. There's thousands of storms in there and things, and a number of annual exceedance probabilities, and you get many permutations of possible data. But I guess it would probably be that in terms of the tier 1 risk assessment, that would be that June timeframe.
Catherine, that was your question. I unmuted you if you also want to unmute yourself and let us know if that answered your question, or if you had any additional.
Yep, no, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. Let me just check to see if we have any hands raised. Hope, did you have a question this time?
It may have still been raised from before, Donnie. But
okay.
One thing I'm thinking is lots of interest in the coastal hazard system. So at the end of our presentation today, we're canvassing ideas for kind of our next webinar. And so, Drew, it looks like there might be some interest there for CHS. That's just kind of what I'm hearing. But we'll be open to any suggestions that we receive. Let's see.
I'm not seeing any additional questions. If there are any, please feel free to type those in or raise your hand. If not, we'll move on to the next section of the presentation.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, so my name is Idris Dobbs. I'm the economics lead. I'll be discussing some of a brief overview of the SACS Tier 2 Economic Risk Assessment and the Measures and Cost Library. If you go to the next slide, please. So these are a couple of the foundational SACS products that we're going to be discussing, and some of the methods for coordinating those tools so that they work in conjunction with each other. It's important to note that these are tools to help get people going, to hopefully frame the issues correctly so that your formulation process can go more smoothly and you can more easily identify the appropriate measures necessary for accomplishing your coastal storm risk management objectives. So first we're going to discuss the development and organization of problems, assumptions, and opportunities, and why those things matter. Then we'll discuss the Tier 2 Economic Risk Assessment, why it was done, and what it entails and contains. And then next we'll discuss the Measures and Cost Library, and finally how to use those tools in conjunction. Next slide, please. Okay, problems, assumptions, and opportunities. So we typically define CSRM-related problems as, existing negative conditions related to coastal storms that should be described usually in terms of a resource of concern that you care about, ultimately your exposure, your exposed value, the location of those resources, why that resource is under threat, and any supporting evidence for the problem. So we typically think of problems as uncontroversial, best represented by simple factual statements with supporting evidence. Risk based on these are typically the least speculative. You know that there's a risk there, the damage has happened in the past. So then we get to our assumptions. Our coastal storm risk management assumptions deal with, we're talking about exogenous factors that can have an influence on the risk context, things that lead the risk to change over time. So for example, will people take action to protect their property? Is the area depopulating in a way that would render concerns about threatened resources immaterial? Is development expected to grow significantly over time? Then there's a spatial context in the area of concern. Are resources that haven't been threatened now, are they expected to be threatened in the future? What factors would cause that? And then there's your hazard context. What will cause the hazard to change over time? Sea level rise, subsidence, a rapidly evolving shoreline, tidal forces, all of the above. These are the things that could change how your risk picture over time. So then you consider the interplay between your assumptions and your problems that may impact the determination of the spatial extent and the severity of your risk. Statements of CSRM assumptions should include the assumption and why you made it, how you expect it to affect the risk. Since these are the assumptions that are going to involve the future, they are your sources of uncertainty. So then there's opportunities. There's CSRM-related opportunities, or your desired future positive conditions that potentially impact resources as related to coastal storms. They haven't yet happened yet, but maybe they're expected to happen in the future if all your assumptions, hold to the same trajectory. So as such, there's an opportunity to manage future risk. Risk derived from opportunities tend to be more speculative in nature. Next slide, please. So those are some of the things that you should consider when trying to define your problems and define your area of concern so that you can drill down on the risk in question that you're trying to manage. So here we get to the Tier 2 economic risk assessment. Its purpose is to basically provide information on storm surge inundation risk to public and private property, assist in determination of potential high-risk areas, and estimate focus area damages in support of the SACS. But it's also used to provide a method that allows users to quickly get an idea of coastal storm risk associated with an area of concern. It provides a method to allow users to quickly scale damages with the cost of measures. So the tool should be used to get a rough idea of potential damages and risk for like a federal interest determination or an alternative milestone with fairly minimal effort. It's also used to identify areas that warrant a deeper technical analysis. So the graphic that you see on your screen is a screenshot of storm surge dollar damage risk from the Tampa Bay, Florida region. It's on a census block by census block level of resolution depicted in dollars. Next slide, please. So what does the Tier 2 ERA consist of? The products, currently the Tier 2 ERA is a technical report and a web application that you can access through the SACS main portal. They provided you with I believe the link is provided in the chat. The FEMA has this flood loss mitigation model was ran on all areas within the zone of tidal influence for North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi. The FEMA flood assessment tool, assessment structure tool was used to estimate storm surge damages for Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands. So just a quick recap. This tool was developed basically to take advantage of existing data sources over a wide area, which is why we use the FEMA HAZARDS model and the FEMA flood assessment structure tool. We're trying to get a picture of an overall storm surge risk, which we would expect to be the largest component of damages. So that's why we focused on storm surge risk. Wave attack and erosion tend to be much more localized and concentrated on the shoreline, as Matt mentioned previously, and so that's why that's not included here. Consequences and risk estimates. So we computed consequences for 10, 20, 50, 100, and 500-year return periods. Economic risk is depicted as the expected annual damages to structures and contents from storm surge and from all return periods, assuming the consequences and likelihoods of the return period events are evenly distributed on an annual basis. So all consequences and risks are reflected geospatially at the census block level of resolution. From there, estimates can be aggregated to census tracts, places, counties, etc. Our risk estimates are presented as a range between low and high. So what that entails is the low estimate is reflective of shoreline conditions as they are today with no sea level rise. The high estimate, the only difference between the low and the high is that we include 2.3 feet of sea level rise for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands and 3 feet of sea level rise for the states. Next slide, please. So this is what the SACS Tier 2 Economic Risk Assessment dashboard looks like. You can see that on one side, you have access to the existing condition damages. On the other, the future condition damages, that's with sea level rise. So the way this works is you use your census block selection tool, you select your area of interest. It highlights all of the census blocks that you want to include in your analysis. The screen immediately updates with the range of risk for the census blocks that you selected. So the expected annual damages are depicted in the left and the right-hand corner. So your risk could be considered as a range between these two items. If you look at the histogram on the left and the right side, underneath the expected annual damages, that basically shows you your consequences. So if you get a 10-year, 50-year, 100-year, 500-year event, your expected consequences are shown there. You mouse over it and it'll give you an actual value. In the bottom slide, and a lot of these definitions are included, in the on the screen grab. You can mouse over it and find it once you use the Tier 2 economic risk assessment. I'm not going to cover each one of those in detail, but I've basically explained those to you guys.
Hey, Idris.
Go ahead. Yes.
There's a question in the chat, and I think since you're showing this, it might be good to answer it right now. I know we don't have a live demo, but explaining how to clip the results to your jurisdiction. You can zoom in to the map extent, but is there a good way to look at specific geographies? I believe there is.
So
you want to talk through that?
Yeah, there is a search. I mean, it's hard to see here, but there is a magnifying glass. You click on that, and then you can type in your jurisdiction, census place, or the name, or wherever, and it'll zoom into your area of interest. So, for example, if you wanted to go to Miami, you would just type Miami into the magnifying glass, the search, and it'll snap you straight to Miami. Did that answer the question?
Catherine, I've unmuted you if you would like to unmute.
Yeah, that's
well.
perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so the measures and cost library. Right now, the measures and cost library isn't in as sophisticated of a format as the Tier 2 economic risk assessment. Some decisions have yet to be made on the funding sources and methods for foundational products, such as the measures and cost library. So hopefully more will be coming on that in the months that follow. But the measurement and cost library is basically a standardized measures that can be used to quickly develop risk management options for addressing coastal storm risk problems. Users specify a unit parameter and then develop a rough order of magnitude range of costs for measures that can serve as potential solutions. So it's basically, map a selection of measures and costs to the relevant problem or opportunity. Quickly gain an understanding of rough order magnitude cost for the CSRM effort. Help users put together a range of measures and a range of rough order magnitude costs to begin development of alternatives. It's been used to develop focus area action strategies for the SACs. And it could also be used to quickly put together measures and costs for federal interest determinations and alternative milestone meetings. Currently, documentation to help people start planning coastal storm risk management problems. Right now, the information can be taken straight from the document. As I said before, in terms of an operational tool, decisions are still being made on how that's going to be able to be provided, but at the very least, you'll have the documents for which you can get all the information to start putting together how to use it. Does somebody have a question? Or?
We do actually have quite a few questions. I don't know if you want to pause now or if you want to go ahead and proceed.
Well, yeah, let me get a little bit further along, and then I'll take some questions. Okay.
Sounds good.
So measures provided are non-structural, structural, and natural and nature-based features. Costs are presented in constant dollars and in annualized terms. They're presented in annualized terms mostly so that they can be, in a sense, compared to the Tier 2 economic risk assessment values. Currently, it's gone through review and focused APRs and legal policy review. I mean, right now, there are some comments to incorporate into the document, and then those changes will be incorporated, and I believe it'll be ready to go. So what are the questions?
Okay, our first question is on the Tier 2 ERA, the 20-year has an asterisk. What is special about the 20-year estimates?
Okay, so the 20-year estimate, I'm glad someone asked that. The 20-year estimate is because the 20-year is used mostly in the risk computations for Puerto Rico and the USVI, but not in the CONUS areas. So the states don't have 20-year estimates in the risk. They just have the 10-year, 50-year, 100 and 500-year. Over.
All righty.
Yep.
And our next question is, can you explain what you mean that this tool is a reflection of economic risk and is linked to the NED account? There's a note, how to avoid use of this tool to ensure it does not lead to more hardship and marginalization to low-income vulnerable communities.
Okay, so when I say link to the NED account, NED account in core vernacular is National Economic Development. It's when we describe the effects of plans and conditions, we describe them primarily in terms of the National Economic Development, which is meant to imply a change in the net national value of goods and services. So when we talk about NED, basically what we're talking about is the monetized cost of resources. So for example, coastal storm damages are meant to reflect the value to replace that resource minus its depreciation. So what we're trying to get a sense of is the cost of the resources that would be employed to restore a resource after it's endured damage or been through risk. That's different from the other accounts, which are, I believe what you're talking about, social vulnerability, other social effects, which can deal with community cohesion, effects to employment, effects to the ability of an area to generate its own economic activity, which corresponds with regional economic development account, and so on and so forth. So in the measures and costs library document, there is a section in there that expounds on these accounts and expounds on how measures can be used to try to capture the change in value or impacts to some of those other accounts and items such as life safety, community cohesion, so on and so forth. Does that answer the question?
Diana, does that answer your question? I can unmute you.
We can unmute. We can unmute.
Yeah, let me get to her. Sorry.
While we're doing that, I just want to say, in the core planning process, we do have to evaluate all 4 accounts. So the National Economic Development account being one of them. The others are the Regional Economic Development account, the Environmental Quality account, and the other social effects account. So this is just one component to evaluation in the core process. Diana, are you on?
Yes, I'm on. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
We can.
Yeah, okay. So you kind of answered, but not really, to be honest. I guess maybe it is a more complicated thing to explain, but I understand you said you have different accounts. But it seems like, in my experience, when it comes to selecting, like plans, that this economic one tends to have more weight. And so that's where my concern comes from. You know, as I see this tool, I see elected officials and I see a bunch of people who control money potentially using this to favor what we have right now, which is that, you know, some communities get the most of the advantage of our federal spending on, you know, to deal with vulnerability, you know, resiliency and so forth. And so that's where my concern is. How is this tool going to make sure that it's not like favor over these other accounts and tools that you develop for them that measure the human cost, right? That measure the impact to wildlife species and so forth.
Right. So the intent of these.
I'll just end with this because I just have to, because it's just a homeless person. Yeah, and I see we have many of them in downtown Miami that literally live under bridges, in tents. You know, some of them value, their value is so much greater than the value of certain people that own little islands with big mansions that they hardly ever live on. So I'll just end there.
Right. I understand where you're coming from. You know, just to clarify, I mean, the measures and cost library or the Tier 2 economic risk assessment, I mean, the intent of these tools is to give you an idea of where to focus effort. So one of the things that we found is that, you know, there are areas that have high, you know, concentrations of damage, Miami being one of them, and areas that tend to have, you know, a lot of population and asset density also tend to correspond with areas that are also socially vulnerable. So I wouldn't say in this case that a description of high economic damages would preclude considerations of areas with higher social vulnerability as well. But I mean, in order to iron a lot of those items out, you need to get into more of a Tier 3 level analysis. And so in the measures and cost library, I mean, there is information in there about what kind of items you can use, what kind of metrics you can use to try to identify more socially vulnerable concerns and try to capture those as part of your description of conditions, your description and forecast of conditions. So there's ways to measure those things. To be honest, I think hopefully the science will be advanced further. You know, I mean, that's more of a tertiary or third order economic consequence, and those are more difficult to capture than basically physical damages associated with the coastal storm event. So,
right.
More on that. This isn't intended to preclude what you're saying, so I understand where you're coming from.
Yes, exactly. I was just going to build upon that, Idris, and just, you know, these are tools to be used for screening level, and I think you kind of outlined in the beginning, you know, their purposes and the assumptions that we have to take going into them and their intended uses, but certainly they're just screening level tools, and they're, you know, not the only tools that are to be used in decision making, but certainly can help if you're trying to answer questions about economic damages.
Correct. So, okay, next slide.
We do have a few more questions here. In the tool, the areas that are color-coded do not allow us to see the area underneath, like the streets and lots, for example. Is there a way to turn on the transparency?
I believe you can turn off the layer. You can turn off the layer in this tool, can't you, Trevor?
Yeah, you can turn off the layer. Also, the census blocks are incorporated into the state and territory applications that Matt referenced earlier. So if you're looking for a specific state, you can go in and toggle on those layers. And within those applications, you can control the transparency as well as overlay a wide variety of other tax layers and state-specific data.
So checking out the web apps, the state and territory specific web applications.
Okay.
Okay.
And one additional question, is the damage calculated on flooding of structures using finished floor elevation or just ground level?
We try to use finished floor elevations.
Okay, I think that's all the questions we have for now. If you want to proceed, I will move us to the next slide.
Okay. I believe I covered this slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just to describe some of the measures and cost library considerations. If you go through the document, you can we expound on this in greater detail. But if you look at the graphic on the screen, the risk is conceptualized as a combination or a function of the hazard, which is the loading condition, 10-year, 20-year, 30-year, 10-year, 20-year, 50-year, 100-year flood event. Performance, which is basically the physical setting, how is the flood going to propagate into the exposure, which is, you know, the items that you care about, be that homes, people, critical infrastructure, so on and so forth. That exposure is correlated with a certain vulnerability. So once the flood event hits the exposure, how much harm is it likely to endure, and then the consequences of the harm. So the consequences in terms of the measures and cost library are associated with dollar damages of losses. So assuming this event hits, this is how much damage you're going to get. So the measures are in a sense correlated with interdicting that risk. You can either interdict it at the physical setting level, which is primarily the domain of hardened structures or natural nature-based features. So you interdict the flood before it gets to the exposure, or you have exposure-based coastal storm risk management approaches. In that case, you're trying to make a change to the resiliency or the existence of the exposure. So, for example, you can have temporary retreat when you're trying to evacuate certain populations, or permanent retreat. Maybe you have buyouts of assets to remove people and the assets and the value from the exposed area. Then you have vulnerability-based coastal storm risk management approaches, which involve retrofitting, elevating, flood-proofing, so on and so forth. Your decision-based approaches incorporate, all of the above and are typically associated with more of a long-term strategy, zoning, so on and so forth. So you have measures that maybe they can stop the short-term risk over time while you make changes to your area in order to accommodate the long-term risk. So your non-cost considerations, are basically approaches that deal with which risk component is manipulated to manage the risk. We describe things in terms of CSRM methods that deal with how the risk component is manipulated. Your functions describe whether reducing inundation, wave attack, or erosion are primary or secondary functions of the measure. Applicability deals with the measure's ability to handle, for example, wave energy. How resilient does that measure need to be? Physical and temporal considerations deal with how the measure influences the physical condition to achieve risk management effects, as well as a qualitative assessment of when those effects would be realized over time. P&G account qualitative assessment, which we discussed earlier. Do you want to make changes to enhance resiliency in your MED, basically your physical structures, or your RED, which is economic activity generated, your OSC, which is basically your social and human resiliency, or your environmental quality, which is the extent to which environmental resources are influenced. And there's a qualitative assessment of sea level rise adaptability. So all of these things can be found, and they're associated with the measures in the document. In terms of cost considerations, we look at regional locational factors. There's design and cost components, which basically all the minimum number of dimensions that you need to describe in order to actually cost out a measure. There's considerations for contingency, engineering and design, supervision and administration, monitoring and adaptive management, and uncertainty. What we don't have, which we were unable to have in the measures and cost library, is real estate considerations or environmental resources. Those are site-specific items that could affect your cost, and you would have to have some kind of idea how important those items are to your cost estimate. Next slide. And so this slide is basically giving you an idea of the type of measures that are associated with each risk component. You can look at these more closely in the document. I won't cover them all here, but this is basically to give you an idea of all the measures that we have considered in the measures and cost library, what their influence on the risk are and how they would affect everything over time in terms of the risk. Next slide, please. Okay, before I go into this, were there any other questions?
We don't have any questions on the question log. Just check real quick for any hands raised. I'm not seeing any. I think we can proceed.
Okay. All right, so this is just a brief overview of how these tools are basically intended to be used. As I mentioned before, these are some of the steps, obviously quickly, identify the problem extents based on considerations of your problems, assumptions, and opportunities, as I covered earlier in the presentation. Then you would use web tools to select the census blocks within those extents. Then you record the range of risk and consequences for existing and future conditions. And those form the boundaries of your estimate, the low and the high estimates. Next slide. And so then you would use the measures and cost library and select an array of measures that align with your problems. You enter the estimated measure length or other parameters as described, and they'll tell you what's needed to cost out the measure. You enter those relevant parameters, and you should be able to compute your constant dollar or annualized cost in terms of a rough order of magnitude, and compare that to the Tier 2 economic risk assessment. So your constant dollar cost would be, you would compare those, for example, to your return period consequences, and your annualized cost would be compared to your expected annualized damages. Both of those items can be found in the Tier 2 economic risk assessment. So in terms of a decision criteria, if the measure is likely too expensive in terms of economic justification, if your high range of cost exceeds your low range of consequences and risk. Also, you should be aware that, a lot of this depends on your decision criteria. For the Corps of Engineers, NED is a crucial decision criteria. You can specify if you want decisions to be made on OSC or RED grounds. Those things may be more important to you, and that should form the basis for how you make your decisions. And so then it's important to describe the risks and uncertainties with making decisions without getting more specific information. And that would form the basis for an information acquisition plan. You should be able to tell, for example, where the measures and cost library comes up short. For example, if for example, your environmental resources or real estate concerns are really important, then you should probably factor those things in to any decision that you're going to make. And it's going to be crucial to collect data and information on those additional costs. So in this case, for example, we would be comparing the risk range estimate, the $4 to $9 million range, with the range of costs shown in this table here that I have in this screen grab. So with that, are there any other questions?
We do not have any questions in the question or chat. If there's any question, go ahead.
Yeah, we just have one more slide in the slide deck really to cover with content that may be of interest. So I was just gonna kind of talk through that really quick, and then if any other questions come in, then we can answer those until the end of our allotted time today. Well, first off, thanks, Idris, for going through that detailed overview of our Tier 2 ERA and measures and cost library. Those tools I know will be helpful for many stakeholders to kind of take initial looks at their problems and understanding kind of what measures they can potentially apply. So as we are looking towards the end of our study here, just wanted to give an outlook about what we'll be doing here. So ongoing, we put our draft report out for review. We received hundreds of comments, and we are in the process of making edits in response to those, not only the public comments, but our internal policy comments and our technical review comments. So working to close those out and finalize our recommendations. As Matt was saying, a lot of our recommendations are kind of shifting as we have advances being made between when we wrote those recommendations and today. So we are targeting our next webinar for May. Date is TBD, to be determined at this time, but we're targeting a May webinar. If you have something that you want to see in the next webinar, we'd like to hear from you. So go ahead and please place your desired subject in the questions box. We'll certainly look through those and figure out if we can pull something together that applies to most. And then as we are looking towards the summer timeframe, I know you heard us mention June as far as when we'll have data available for download. And we're really targeting June because that's when we can say with certainty that the documents are final. And we wouldn't want to put anything out there that's not yet final. So that's why we're targeting June. You can see their district commanders will be signing their respective appendices. We'll be submitting that up to our division, South Atlantic Division, for final report approval. And that's where the main report will be signed in August timeframe. And then we'll transmit our products up to headquarters and for review by the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, so the ASACW. That is our timeframe moving forward here, but we'll continue our webinars up until the end, share with you our updates, and we will be posting our newsletters as well on our SACS webpage. So that is it for us. I think we've got a little bit of time here for some questions, if any came in.
We do. Let's see. Thank you for sharing these tools. Is there state-by-state info from which we can learn and share what we may offer?
Trevor, I'll just respond to that. We do have our state and territory web applications. So if you go to our GeoPortal page, you can get to it from the SACS webpage here, follow through to the GeoPortal, and you can see the web applications for each respective state and territory. I'll leave it at that for now. Hopefully that answered that question.
Yep, looks like that answers his question. We have a few suggestions for the future. We do have one question. If we have questions, how can we ask these during our review process?
So if you could just go to the next slide, please. So if you've got a question that pertains to your appendix, you've got a, if you have a question and you're in Charleston, we have district project managers. So for each district working on the SACS, we have a project manager and a full project delivery team within each of our districts. But if it's something that applies more broadly to one of our technical products or tools, you can reach out to our command center team leads. We'd be happy to assist you, but if not, you can always send an email to that outreach email, sacs@usaystararmy.mil, and we'll make sure it gets to the right person.
Right, it looks like there's a few suggestions for future webinars that the team will review, but I'm not seeing any additional questions at this time. We do have just about 2 minutes left. If you have a question and would like to raise your hand, I can unmute you. We'll just take a few seconds to make sure there's no additional questions.
There's a question about, can you publish a list of all tools that are available with a brief description? We tried to do that with our key products on our SACS placemat, but they can all be found on our webpage and they have a brief description beneath their icon.
Did you indicate when the next iteration of report will be available for review?
We are not going out for public. We do not have another public review period. It's similar to all of our feasibility studies that we have. We have a draft comment period, and then we move into final.
Will the participant list be available?
I have to go back and see what we've done before. I know that we do record our webinars and we post those on our web page, but as far as attendee lists, I'm not sure if we've done that in the past, so I'll have to check with Lisa on that.
Okay, and then a question, when will the final be posted? I'm assuming that's a question about the final report.
Yes, that's targeting for August. All right, Donnie, it's 3:30. Yep. I see a lot of people dropping off now.
Yep.
Just want to say, before everybody dropped off, just wanted to say thanks. But thank you to all of you who are sticking with us and are tuning into our SACS webinars. We appreciate it.
Everyone have a great day. This will be posted to the SACS website in the near future.